I feel like I understand like 60% of this. Or there's like a 60% chance that I understand all of it. Whichever one of those sounds better. I'm not entirely sure. We'll see. But let's put ourselves out there.
I feel like I know what point he's trying to make.
Yes.
Which I feel like is the most valuable thing to take it away. I don't really want to be able to... I'm not an academic. I don't need to be able to assess his argumentation. You know, it's just like,
we're not going to need to get up in front of people and talk about it.
He's got sufficiently many like Marxological words in it, and like there's a reference to Hegel at least once. So like like, and it's sort of like references academics, which I don't know anything about, but I think that I agree with. It's fine. It's perfect. It's perfect for my
I'm on their
idiot
side.
brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm supposed to like them. All right.
Yeah,
cool.
Exactly. He's anti-Tony Cliff, you know?
Anti-Tony Cliff. I know, yeah. Kick him while he's down. I did think it was very funny in this. So it's like we read this thing where he's like, I am in full agreement with Tickton. And it's like, I haven't read that. And then, like the whole second half of this is him being like, I'm going to critique Istvan Mazaros and Beyond Capital. And I'm like, I also haven't read that. Hey, but let's talk about it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah. That's what happens if you read a journal article that's been made from a conference paper. This is what you're gonna get.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know.
Oh well. What are you gonna do? How are you feeling? Last episode you were a bit black-pilled. How are you doing this time? I remember you saying, "Is communism possible?" After reading this, do you feel it's more possible or less possible?
This is back to like being slightly mechanistic, right?
Oh, sure.
So this does, like, the argument that's being made here, I feel does fit in with my schema. Or for like a schema for like what is socialism? You know, what would a necessary transformation of the economy look like to bring about, you know, some kind of socialist post-capitalist world? I feel like this fits in with that agenda.
Your schematic agenda.
Yeah. And although it's dealing with like the collapse of the Soviet Union, like it's not the question is not like
my bad, I fucked up. I tried to move one thing off my desk and it ruined everything. You were talking about your schematic demands for a transitional state of communism.
In a charitable reading, what I was doing, I was waffling, and an uncharitable reading, I was pontificating. So, you know, I don't think it matters really. I don't feel black pilled, but maybe I just haven't been thinking about it.
That's the best way to not be black pilled. Is just don't think about it.
Yeah, I haven't really been thinking. I tell you what happened. I spent all day reading that Joshua. Well, no, it wasn't Joshua Clover. What did we read? Jasper Burns. We read that Jasper Burns book. I spent all day reading it. We had an hour and a half conversation about it, and then I went to my local pub, which, you know, happens to be a place I work, and I was reading. Naturally, I was reading The Eclipse and Reemergence of the Communist Movement.
Oh, wow.
At least the first page of it, I was just like, you know, I don't know, I was just hanging about. I wanted to have something to hide behind.
You were reading the first page of Gilles Dauvet's.
Reading the first page of Gilles Dauvet's introduction to the Japanese edition of whatever. And, you know, it really doesn't matter.
And you're thinking about how great life is.
And then somebody asked me what I was reading, you know, and I just like completely fumbled the social ball entirely. So that's my experience. That's my experience of being.
So that's my answer.
Well, no, that's my experience of being a self-identifying communist.
Yeah, I do
to show somebody I was reading Gilles Dauvet and then have a panic when they sort of like assumed that communism meant gulags, and I just had no answer for them because I'd spent all day reading a book and then an hour and a half talking about it. I didn't really want to have to think about a good answer to why I was a communist or not. Enough. And then I was like, am I a communist? What does it mean? So I might have actually spent the last 2 weeks in total denial, after realizing that I have no answer to the question.
Well, we call
Why
that
or am I a
praxis where I'm
communist?
from.
Yeah.
We call that praxis. Somebody you take a communist text into public, somebody asks you what it is, you panic, and then you spend the next 2 weeks being like, I don't think I am a communist. I'm not cut out for this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Maybe
Wow.
I should just join Jeremy Corbyn's non-party.
Hey, the new party. The new party that I don't think has a name yet, unless I've missed something.
No.
Cool, man. Cool.
Yeah.
What's your read on that? Do you think that's just going to be another kind of like stay relevant? Or do you think it's actually going to be like legitimately like a new independent party that people attempt to rally around?
It doesn't... I think it's going to be that to some extent. I think it's probably going to split that section of the social democratic left, which was allied to the Corbyn project, is going to be split now between Corbyn, Labour, and the Greens, and people are going to have decided which of those three they're committed to, I suppose. That's speaking in terms of the activist base, the people that they might want to actually recruit to this project. As for voters, I think they might steal more of the left of Labour voters than they might initially have appealed to a good chunk of voters, I suppose. Don't know whether it's seems like a somewhat disparate group of people. But hey, I mean, like, if it's just like trying to give Keir Starmer a bloody nose, I'm all in favour of that. So
hey,
on those grounds alone, I'm pro.
That's communism.
Pro it, yeah, whatever. Praxis, at least.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know.
No, we'll see. I'm looking forward to seeing what they name it. The Peace and Freedom Party. Maybe they should call it that. Has that been taken?
Yeah. I look forward to reading a comprehensive history of it in 150 years when it becomes relevant to the timeline of this project.
I look forward to reading a comprehensive history of it that's longer than 20 pages.
Okay. After it's inevitably collapsed.
Yeah, exactly.
The pressure of its
after the Labour
not
Party
having sufficient form or something.
Yeah. Well, good transition.
Ooh.
Because speaking of content and form, 2 ideas that I thought I understood that after reading this, I'm not so sure. The cookie metaphor, that kind of threw me for a loop. We're reading an essay by a guy named Christopher J. Arthur, Epitaph for the USSR, Clock Without a Spring. I've seen references to this one a few times, never engaged with it. I've never engaged with Tickton. We've never engaged with any of that stuff on the show before. But we decided to read this one because it was mentioned in what we read last week. It was a footnote in the Jasper Burns book. And he kind of used it as a point of comparison when he's talking about like the kind of councilist approaches, like a group of international communist like proposals for communism. He was like, that is a proposal that doesn't necessarily like have a spring. It doesn't necessarily have a thing that would make it tick. It's a set of social relations, sure, but is it a mode of production? Probably not. And the reason he says that is because in this essay, which is, I think, like kind of famous and kind of made the rounds, that's exactly the argument that the author makes about the USSR. We've never really like delved too deeply into, I think, questions about like, what was the Soviet Union? Was it a generated worker state? Was it this? Was it that? Like, we did that LL Men reading where he kind of like briefly alludes to the fact that he is like, it was private property. It's just capitalism, wasn't it? Which is really funny and really cool. We should read the second part of that essay one day. But I don't know. I found this one pretty convincing, and it's interesting because it kind of comes from some like an interesting background where it's like kind of value for me. It's very like, I don't know what this word means, but I'm going to say it anyway. Hegelian. The author spends the first section kind of laying out his view of the dialectic as it relates to cookie dough, and then kind of gets into what does this mean about what the Soviet Union was? What actually is a mode of production? And then he hassles somebody else for the latter part of the essay to kind of make the point about capital versus capitalism, which is all really interesting. Like I said, I think I'm like 60% sure that I understood this, but I'm interested in talking about it because I think, that's how I'm going to understand it. So, yeah. And it also, like, there were just loads of things in here that we've been having conversations recently about, like, proposals for communism and stuff. And then that kind of gets us into like, well, what do you actually consider a mode of production? Blah, 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 blah. And I was kind of like stoked when I was reading this because I was following his argument, but then I was like, well, how is he actually defining a mode of production? And then I turned the page and he's like, so what is a mode of production? And it's like, yes, excellent. So yeah, I dug this. And I think it made me slightly more optimistic. If for no other reason than I think there's a reading of this where you can just be like, all we got to do is what the USSR did, which is like make it so you can fire workers. Which I'm joking, but there are some funny readings of this, I would say. So yeah, I dug it.
So you mean like quote unquote communist capitalist China? Is that what you want?
Yeah, exactly. They did it. Yeah. Oh my God, we're almost there. The century of Xi Jinping.
Yes, yeah. Xi Jinping read Hillel Ticktin and took entirely the wrong lesson. Is that it?
Google Halal Ticktin. Yeah. So what'd you make of it?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, as I say, I don't know. This might be another one where we completely missed the point or something. Please let us know. I don't know. Oh no, I claimed to understand the point, didn't I? Just
you understood. Yeah,
everything else has eluded me.
You understand the form of the argument. You don't understand the content. Or do you understand the content, not the form? I don't know. The matter.
I think I understand the matter of the content. You know?
They're letters. They are letters.
They are letters on this. Yes, I enjoyed this. I had a similar thought process to you, which was how many times have we ever engaged this argument? I like to think maybe we have, but maybe we haven't. I think you are correct in identifying us as having sort of like read people who've just been like, yeah, it was capitalist kind of thing, and not really like actually engaged it very well. All those, I mean, I don't really remember what LMN's argument was. I'm pleased to engage Ticktin. It's somebody that I've heard of many times and thought probably quite a useful piece of the puzzle. And that argumentation is, well, that argument for what kind of mode of production or not mode of production, as the case may be, the Soviet Union was, I think is put forward very eloquently here. Obviously, like you described the sort of three segments of this essay, and the middle one is very sort of like concrete in its analysis. Sort of explains how the Soviet Union worked in the at least in the case of its content, I suppose, and how that sort of was just basically just didn't function as a mode of production. And the reasons why it was. So from that, this might even be the first time that we've engaged in any concrete way with a sort of like almost like social history of the Soviet Union. How did factories work? How did workers engage with managers? How did managers engage with planners? Obviously, this isn't a comprehensive analysis of that, but this might be the first time that we've touched on some of those topics as well. So, yeah, good content.
Good content, I suppose. And we're making content.
Oh, yeah.
I mean? Yeah. Yeah.
But in what form?
Yeah, in what form? Oh God. I mean, it's all interesting.
Like, it's not funny.
I think I'm kind of trying to think of where to start. I mean, maybe we just start with like he just comes out and is like, it wasn't a mode of production, the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And I think my kind of understanding of that argument, I think because maybe like we engaged with a bit more systems theory like stuff as we were engaging with Marxism, and then before we engaged with kind of like critiques of what modes of production are, blah, 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 in something like this. My understanding of modes of production has always been very like systemic, like, and so I've never really understood why people would say non-mode of production, because it's like, well, surely there were rules, even if they were always changing and dynamic. Like, surely you could describe a way that this system works, even if it doesn't follow the like rules we would like to see them follow in Marxism. And this essay has done quite a bit to kind of like open my eyes to the ideas of like what it actually means to have a non-mode of production. It's weird though, because like one part of my brain really still wants there to be hard and fast rules for what a mode of production are. And when in this essay, he says things like, so what is a mode of production? It's a stable, relatively harmonious combination of social form and material content. Or like in the next page, he's like, you know, a mode of production is an organic whole that reproduces itself almost automatically. And it's like almost automatically, like relatively harmonious. It's like, I kind of feel like I want a bit more of a definition than that. but you can definitely see what he's saying. And I think his, guiding metaphor here, which is a clock, which is like, sure, there were social relations of production in the Soviet Union, obviously, like because it was humans doing things. Um, the metaphor of the clock is like there was a clock, but there was nothing making it tick, which, when you apply to like a mode of production, like there was no guiding set of rules that allowed it to be relatively harmonious and reproduce itself kind of automatically. Like the history of the Soviet Union was one of, you know, big pushes when things needed to get done, never meeting targets, plans being made, intimidation tactics, people pushing back against intimidation tactics, nothing really ever working, and then it collapsing, right? So it's like, I think his metaphor of like, it was a clock without a spring. It was like, adjacent to capitalism, but without the value form. It was, which is like the law of value is the guiding thing of capitalism. So like attempting to do capitalist things, attempting to do socialist things, but not really having either. Like in terms of its guiding project or the thing that makes it tick. I think is an interesting argument for just being like it wasn't a mode of production at all, because like what are we actually even talking about here? Just a set of people haphazardly doing things. You know what I mean? It's interesting.
I mean, they were producing, I suppose.
Things got produced.
Yeah.
A lot of things didn't.
There was a whole, maybe the wrong things in the wrong way. Yeah. But, like society reproduced itself to some degree. I mean, I guess, like, I mean, I always revert back to this question, right? But like, we have sort of read certain historical texts and taken a certain approach to considering modes of production, which recognizes both their historical specificity and then also the continuity between them all, and so to some degree that sort of raises the question, well, like, how long is it possible to labor in a discontinuity between modes of production before something stabilizes? I mean, there's a degree to which he seems to be describing this as kind of like a stalled transition or a stalled process. He also implies that, like, really what was driving it forward was largely conditions of war. I suppose if you think about the history of the Soviet Union, it's quite easy to see it as, like, in a lot of ways being in conditions of a war economy for quite a long time. If it's the Civil War, then leads into the preparation for World War II, and then the sort of like the process of the Cold War, and only when that sort of like thawing happens, perhaps you could tie some of the breakdown into at least not having that driving compulsion, sort of forcing the economy to limp on, I suppose. But yeah, it's there is a frustrating degree of vagueness, I suppose, when it comes to attempts to identify what a mode of production is in this case, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, because on one hand I do get it, but on the other hand, it's like, so when you talk about a transition to communism, is there just going to be a period where you just would say you didn't have a mode of production? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's like, is it only really a mode of production when everybody can kind of like high communism, when everybody can just take as needed? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you take that, Tickton? But yeah, I mean, basically,
I mean, I don't know. I guess like we'd have to identify what the driving motivation of communist social relations, communist productive relations will be. I guess we can look to some degree about his discussion of, because his discussion of the advent of capitalism is quite curious in this one, because like he's doing this form of argumentation where he's kind of identifying a staged process, and it's one that we've come across before, this distinction between like formal and real subsumption, but at the same time trying to deny, I felt anyway, that like that this was one linear process, one precedes the other, was almost trying to imply that like the sort of a dialectical relationship was there immediately, in the sense that there were two necessary elements at play, I suppose, rather than first you develop the content of capitalism, you sort of develop primitive capital, I suppose, and a desire to invest in it and improve labor, and then you develop the appropriate form for the valorization of capital in the form of the factory system, I suppose, and the real subsumption. It was he had a very simple description of what real subsumption means. He just says that's the point in which through the development into capitalism, where you reach the point where there's no going back, kind of thing. Like you're sort of committed to the, all that's, it's been let out of the box to some degree. I mean, that makes sense because what you're destroying is all of the social relations that made feudalism possible. You know, like you're destroying the peasants' relationship to the land and dispossessing them of their connection to productive apparatuses, I suppose. But then also you're destroying the artisan relationship to production and introducing like automated factory processes, which devalue the work of small artisans, I suppose. But like, there's a concrete historical process which is easy to understand, but just sort of funny he sort of like phrases it in that way of like, you know, this is when you reach the tipping point and you can't go back to something from before, you know. And capitalism's on its way at that point. I mean, like, it's at that point that the self-propelling force of capitalism kicks in, which is what we're looking for, right? To make a mode of production count as a mode of production, I suppose, in his argumentation.
Yeah, it's when capital like really fully starts to actually run production, right? It's interesting, like all of that stuff. It's easy, and when people talk about the origin of capitalism, it's so easy to like slip into teleology, as you know, and be like, well, now it's at this point. Look, they kicked the peasants off the land on this farm. Now it's definitely the snowball's rolling down the hill. You know what I mean? But it's interesting because it's like it's one thing to be like do Smithian stuff, to be like capitalism was always there, it just needed to have the fetters removed. But then it's another thing to just describe what happened. It's like that is what happened. You know what I mean? So it's like let's hope something similar happens with communism. So I mean, I think I'm going to try and avoid a little bit of the jargon that he uses to kind of make his point, just to kind of dumb it down, if for no other reason than for myself. But like he makes the point, which we should all kind of like understand, which is that in capitalism, control over like the distribution of social labor and kind of, the disciplining of producers takes place indirectly, right? But it still happens. It still takes place. Like it takes place indirectly through the commodities, through the value form. The law of value disciplines producers, kind of like something like a law of production price determines where money actually gets spent and kind of where capital goes and all these different things. And his point is, and he kind of brushes over this, and this is obviously something that's pretty controversial, but he just says, because that form of indirect control, which is to say the law of value, didn't exist in the Soviet Union, there was no real meaningful way for social labor to be regulated and distributed and for production to like take place in a coherent way. Like he gives all of these really, really fascinating examples about how like the Soviets were really trying to do scientific, production on the scale of and using the techniques of different capitalist firms. But he gives this example where it's like, Fiat built I think it was Fiat, some car company built a factory in the Soviet Union. And if you were to compare that factory to the factory in like Italy, it required like, X times as much labor because, well, this kind of gets into a different point, but because kind of like the form of capitalist production still existed, but kind of the content, which is what made it itself, law of value, these kind of things, like was actually gone. But I thought that was like a very good point. We can maybe get to that last bit here in a second, but like just to return to that idea of, we always think of capitalism as like this anarchy of the market, anarchy of production, but capitalism does have a way of, even though it's just a bunch of private producers producing for exchange, like it does have a way to actually control production. And when the Soviet Union got rid of that, according to Arthur, that just left it as a clock without a spring. It was trying to do all of the things that capitalism did in a way that capitalism did them, but it had no way of really meaningfully regulating things. And, kind of like apologists for the Soviet Union or whatever would be like, well, what about the bureaucrats? Maybe that's not quite how they'd say it, but like, what about the system of central control that, we just got to do that again, but make it better. He's just kind of saying like, that is not a substitute for capitalist social relations. And in a society where the productive apparatus has been developed to such a sophisticated point as it has under capitalism, you can't just kind of like wing it. Like you do need a set of like, if not rules, like you need a new content of society that is able to not just figure out a way to like plan things better, because you don't just want to say communism is capitalism but more rational. That's kind of like a silly thing. Like you want to marry that with workers control. He doesn't call it workers control here. I think he calls it like workers self-management or something. But like this is the idea that Paul Maddock talks about, how there's workers control versus, I forget what he says, but like, I think he says at some point in this essay, like something like this new social form can only come into being, this communist social form can only come into being with actual self-management. And if you're trying to do it in any other way, it's not going to work. And he also doesn't say this, but I think you can apply it from his analysis, but like it will revert to capitalism because that is just much more stable and it just makes more sense. So that I kind of buy it, honestly. I kind of buy it.
Yeah. And I'm like, I'm quite pleased that you, similarly, for the sake of my own sort of like lack of understanding, but it's quite there's like obviously there's a lot of use of like Marxist terminology and it's all very important, and this like argumentation from the standpoint of like form and content has a really important sort of driving force behind it, I suppose. But like to boil it down to like the very basics, it's just like the capitalism needs to be able to discipline labor through the market, through the comparison of the products of labor, to the point where it's in fact it's not even the boss necessarily that's disciplining the worker anymore. It's like the commodity is determining all of our social relations, or all of our working relations, all of the relations between human beings are kind of like determined by what the market tells us the value of any commodity is and how much we should be producing of it and when. And the really important part of that is like capitalists have to be in the position whereby they can fire workers. They have to be able to like force the norms of production demanded by market relations onto their workforces, and that very simple aspect of like how the capitalist economy works was just removed from the Soviet Union, but all of the other sort of like content in some respects was left in place. It's like we still have the factory, we still have bodies of workers, we still have, or even if we didn't have that, we only have the example of the process of sort of industrialization and modernization of the economy that's given to us from the capitalist world. We only have that example to follow. So we're kind of like copying the factory form, copying that process of industrialization in some ways, like very rapidly, although quite haphazardly. I was quite sort of taken aback by this because like sometimes when I was taught about this sort of this history, the history of the 5-year plans, although they were chaotic, like the idea that I come away with was that they were in some ways quite successful, at least some of the more industrially minded ones, i.e. like building industrial capacity, not necessarily building consumer production of goods for consumption, but like but he just considers them all to be a failure. Like all of that effort at planning, all of that effort at command and control, it just sort of like describes all of that process as like sort of failing in its most basic aspirations, which I found quite refreshing. But it's quite a simple analysis of the situation. You like take away the ability to discipline workers, and you just have all of these crazy outcomes that he sort of like goes through. Like he has a really interesting comparison between like how capitalism develops just in time production, like that process of striving toward ever more efficient productive capacity, the sort of like the full valorization of uh, of capital, um, leads to this sort of like hyper efficient, like just in time. You receive your goods for the raw materials just in time to produce them, to deliver them to the next person, kind of thing. I can't remember what phrase he uses to describe the communist version, the Soviet version of that, like never in time production or something, like just like and sort of describe it in the context of like the because the chain of supply of goods was so poor, there's this compulsion to just hoard materials for production rather than to like um, work with them rapidly and pass them on. Actually, you're trying to sort of hold on to them as much as possible, and a similar compulsion to hoard labor power, right? Because like the plans would come in haphazardly. There'd be very arbitrary deadlines for when things have to be produced. You never know when you're going to get what you need to fulfill your obligation to the plan, but you know the deadline which you have to meet to some degree. So you just have to like hoard up all the capacity, not being particularly efficient in your working day, and then hurriedly make everything that you need to produce at the last minute when the deadline comes in, meaning that you're then producing sort of like poor quality goods that inevitably don't work or break down or whatever. So um his like explanation of the shortcomings of the Soviet economy was very compelling, and his description of why that was, well, what it was that was lacking, although couched in a sort of like quite complex Marxological framing, um, sort of like on a sociological level, quite sort of like simple and easy to understand. I thought so. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting too, right? Like you saying that's kind of made me think, like, what is the law of value for capitalists? It's just a system of information, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like the whole point of capitalism is that nobody's sharing information with each other. So how do you get that information? Well, to be fair, you kind of don't. You kind of just guess. You kind of just go, you take your commodities to the market and you go, is this going to sell? Did I do this efficiently enough? Is this okay? And then it sells and you go, oh, okay, I guess that was fine. Oh, and then you find ways to make more and blah, 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 blah. So like, yeah, it's like this system where you can't discipline workers, but you're trying to basically just do something like capitalism isn't going to work. But also, it's like the producers, the firms themselves, are just like have no information necessary. You know what I mean? It's like, wait, we need to make 100,000 shoes. Huh? We need to give a factory the leather to make 100,000 shoes. How are we gonna? Oh, okay, I guess. So it's interesting because, like, he talks about how this kind of inefficiency and this bureaucratization and the secret police stuff leads to this kind of hoarding attitude, right? But it's also just like not having a market. It's, not having any kind of link between not just other firms coordinating information. Like when that happened in the Soviet Union, it was on a purely informal basis and was kind of like outside of the mode of production itself, if you want to call it that, like the system, I suppose I should say. But like also there's just no information between consumers and producers. So it's like, it's exactly like what you're saying. It's, yeah, a lot of the 5-year plans were successful in some of their goals in the sense of it's like, we got, a satellite in orbit. We built the biggest bomb the world's ever seen. We built like military planes and tanks and won World War II. But it's like, blue jeans and like McDonald's, all of the cool things. I'm just thinking, ask an American what consumer products first come to their mind. It's like blue jeans and McDonald's. But like, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, we see the photos of like the cool Soviet champagne or the cool Soviet watches that are like never going to stop running. But like those weren't common, you know what I mean? And like to the extent that you could point to one commodity and be like, see, there were consumer products in the Soviet Union. It's like, okay, but like, on the whole, we're not talking about a system that really had enough information required to kind of like do communism or even capitalism, like in any kind of like meaningful capacity. It's all just information. It's really, really interesting. I think that that's kind of what his argument gets down to. It's just like there was no way for information to be shared, whether that means like actual people talking to each other or just, knowing how many workers need to be in a factory. It's just, I suppose there's one fix for it. A different kind of bureaucracy. A bureaucracy of a different type. That'll be my first book.
But it's funny in that case that like I mean, I know we covered like last week. We covered Jasper Burns' critique of the fundamental principles and the group of international communists sort of like model for what a communist society might look like and how it might be organized. But like, I think coming back to what we were saying at the beginning of this, like the reason why this sort of like chimes with my understanding of what communism should be, which comes to some degree from reading the fundamental principles of communist production and distribution, is that like that is a clear effort to provide sort of like a communist mode of production with its spring. I suppose it's like, okay, we need to find an organic way of communicating between producers, so that goods are driven through the economy and at appropriate speed with an appropriate degree of efficiency, so that they can be consumed, contribute to the metabolism of human beings. So yeah, I mean, it's just like that's like the reason why this critique of the Soviet Union as a non-mode of production is so compelling is because it kind of like harkens back in some ways to that very early critique of the Soviet Union, a la the group of international communists, I suppose. But
yeah, where they're like just trying to do critiquing them for just trying to do in-kind planning when there's no unit of account. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's interesting too, because like to a certain extent, I know that like councilists probably wouldn't like it phrased in this way, but like to a certain extent, that approach is just kind of giving you a space for market information without having market socialism, quote unquote, market quote unquote socialism. You know what I mean? Because it's like there are very clear ways for production firms to get the information necessary for production based on what consumers are consuming. Consumers are consuming. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I really liked how, just to kind of touch on the bureaucracy stuff for a second, like he makes the point, as you were kind of saying, that, bureaucrats at the end of the day just kind of want a very quiet life, is something that he says, like, because the rewards that the bureaucrats got weren't actually really tied directly to the performance of their firms in a lot of ways. It was kind of just political favor. Like indirectly you could say, okay, yeah, the performance of their firms would buy them political favor, but that's a very indirect way of actually doing things. And in a lot of ways, I'm sure you can imagine different ways in which that wouldn't be the case, right? Or maybe like familial links or something like that. And it's just all basically to say that I think this is kind of when he critiques Mazaros, like he makes the point that you can't start a critique of the Soviet Union by talking about the bureaucracy as this new class, which was kind of like, the cause of the failure of this economy. He's kind of like, you need to start a step before that. And you need to actually explain where the bureaucracy comes from. Why was it necessary for the bureaucracy to function? Because from what I could understand, from what I could glean from Mazaros's argument, Arthur is saying that Mazaros is making some sort of claim like the bureaucrats were the capitalists of Soviet Russia. And he's just kind of saying in no way were they capitalists. They were just like a part of the like social metabolism of the society, which was necessary. And like they weren't making decisions based off of productivity, really. They weren't making decisions off of the law of value, in his estimation. So it's a very good point. I think you can't, like, it's very tempting to start a critique of the Soviet Union by just saying the bureaucracy and the secret police were out of control. But he's like, you need to actually explain why those things were necessary, because I don't think it was anybody's plan right at the beginning, well, maybe except for a few people, to be like, we need a massive bureaucracy and massive state police. It's like, say what you will about the, like, plans of these early Bolsheviks and the lack of plans that they had, but like they were communists at the end of the day. Like nobody was like, except for maybe a few of them, what are you going to do?
I mean, in some ways that like, in some ways my opinion of the Soviet Union is improved by this essay to some degree,
Yeah.
in the sense that like, yeah, they were communists. They recognized that they were endeavoring to overcome capitalism. The mistake that they made was to identify like some aspects of the form. I mean, I'm just going to get confused in this form content, but I'll just pretend, whatever. Like some aspects of the form of capitalism that they had to be overcome. One of them being the like the disciplining of labor by capitalists, and they sort of just abolished that. He said, no, you can't be fired from your job. You do work. You are sort of tied to this workplace. You are secure in your employment and your place in production. You will be have your needs been met by the productive apparatus of society, I suppose. And I'm surprised it took them so long and never really realized the error of that and just decided that they just had to be able to fire the workers for not working hard enough.
Yeah, that's all it was going to take. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because that makes Stalin's claim that value continues under communism seem like much more of a wish than anything else. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, it's actually worse than you think.
Yeah.
That, you know what? That's something actually I kind of want to touch on, is that because it's taken a priori, I guess, like as an assumption here that he just goes, but there was no value in the Soviet Union, and it's kind of like, I don't know. I don't want to wade too much into that. The only thing I'll say is that, like, they were still engaging in global trade. You know what I mean? Like, they still did have to produce to a certain level. It's just that it would seem to me like the influence that the downward pressure that placed on producers was incredibly indirect, and it just had to go through this like political layer. And it sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. And even in here, it seems like he gets a little tripped up sometimes when he's talking about like the goal of a functioning mode of production of like producing more efficiently. And it's like, that's not my communism. You know what I'm saying? It's like, to a certain extent, I suppose, if people wanted to do that, if they decided to do it. But like, I think he phrases it really well.
But we
later
do it with
on
machines,
in the essay.
Jack.
It's machines. Yeah, well, it's fully automated. Exactly. It's Bookchinian communism. He phrases it really well at one point when he says he says something like the political directives in the Soviet Union weren't capable of directing the development of the productive forces. And it's like, okay, I can get behind that. But it's like, he kind of felt like he was normalizing what a mode of production is a little bit to capitalism, where it's like, and this is why the Soviets weren't able to maximize efficiency. And it's like, I mean, I guess they needed to do that because they were starting from like semi-feudal Russia, trying to not just be all wiped off the face of the planet. But, you know, you get what I'm saying.
It's funny. I mean, this is an aside to some degree, but like, I found very interesting when he does discuss the idea of the Soviet Union, like engaging in global trade with the capitalist world, as an example put forward by some people as an example of the influence of capitalism onto Soviet production, I suppose, in a disciplining way. Like, I think he's making the case that like this is the base of Tony Cliff's argument for the Soviet Union being, in some respects, a capitalist country, being a state capitalist country, because it engages in like global trade with capitalist countries. He sort of like flips that on its head in a way that I've never come across before, and said, well, of course, like the Soviet Union, like any prospective like set of countries, part of the world attempting to live under altered social relations that are socialist, would always engage the capitalist world in exchange and trade and whatever. That doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing or a hallmark of one's like being corrupted by capitalism, kind of thing, or like that can't be taken as an example in and of itself of being capitalist. It's interesting. Like I guess the question then becomes like, why didn't the Soviet Union have some kind of feedback of information from the exchange that it was making with the price that it was getting for its goods on the global market? Why didn't that have some kind of disciplining effect on production in the Soviet Union? Maybe it's just for these reasons that like
it's just too indirect.
There was just no capacity to do that. There was no like mechanism for sort of like incorporating that information or that feedback into the productive process.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like that Cliff argument might be like buying into the Soviet propaganda a little bit too much because it's like, but I guess to a certain extent, it was still influencing pressure and like maybe more so than it was just like geopolitical worries because it's like you really only started to see the massive pushes towards industrialization or like the first ones. I mean, when it was like, oh, are the capitalists going to invade again? You know what I mean? Like, oh, now we actually do need tractors. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess I'd probably need to a little bit more about how much it actually influenced production in order to like make any kind of coherent statement on it. I'm sure you can make the argument, as Cliff does, that it had a huge impact, or I'm sure you can make the argument that he does that it had no impact. But yeah, regardless of the impact's quantitative size, it does seem like the impact that it had still needed to be sifted through a pretty incapable productive apparatus. This whole thing kind of got me thinking, like, this argument would almost be better made, and well, not better made. It would be the same thing, but it would be more obvious and more blatant applied to China because it's just like China was just all of this just amped up to 11. Like nobody can really argue that like really any stage prior to like I don't know, like the 90s was like when the kind of state had some sort of coherent plan for actually directing production. Because it's like, when we've done our episodes on China before, it's like how much of it is us just talking about, and then they throw the entire population into the cities, and then that doesn't work. So then they threw them all back into the countryside. And it's like, yeah, if anybody is still out there being like communism is when you do central planning in a more direct way, it's like that's just not a substitute in any way for like a coherent mode of production, right? Like, or at least a relatively harmonious one, as you would say.
Yeah, not just having not having a better plan.
Yeah, we just need a better plan. We'll just do this with a better plan, a 6-year plan.
I wonder whether it's worth just touching on in a minute, like it feels to me like one of the central argument he's attempting to make for for one, the Soviet economy not being capitalist, but also the argument that he's sort of like arguing against, his kind of negative argument, is one which is put forward by people who say because it had the factory form, because people existed in sort of industrial settings, in large industrial workplaces, that was something which like that's a hallmark of the Soviet economy being capitalist, because it had this sort of like disciplining environment. Obviously we make all these allusions to content and form here, but like here's my best effort to like
here we go
to sort of like to explain the argument that he's trying to make. Right, obviously I was alluding to earlier this distinction between formal and real subsumption, right, where like first capitalism takes the material that it gets, the social material from feudalism, the ways of working, and then it kind of like actually refashions those sort of like human relations into a form which is appropriate to what it's attempting to do. Obviously what it's attempting to do is like take capital, well, I guess take capital in the form of money, combine it with production and goods, and then come up with more money than you started with. That's sort of the process. And the sort of like the law of value aspect of that is the kind of like disciplining of labor to make it more efficient, to make you be able to exploit more and extract more from the process and extract more money from the process. And he's saying that like although the factory form is the kind of like appropriate form for that process of exploitation, the actually important content of that process is the law of value, is the existence of value, is that exploitative process. All that really means is all the things we've been talking about through this that we're lacking from the Soviet Union, right? The ability to discipline labor. The reason why he starts his argument for the Soviet Union being a non-mode of production with this discussion of like form and content in Marx, in Marx's writing and Marx's analysis of capitalism and the advent of capitalism, its transition from feudalism into capitalism is so that he sort of like has the intellectual material to then critique arguments that say the problem is the form of production that was being done, rather than the fact that it lacked the content of capitalism. Just because the Soviet Union had the form of capitalism, the sort of industrial workplaces and the relationship between managers and workers and sort of like owners in the form of in the form of the bureaucrats, I suppose, who are not owners, obviously, but like there's sort of like there's a similar formal hierarchy of command over work, but like what it's lacking is the content of capitalism. It's lacking the law of value, I suppose. Obviously, other people make the argument that the law of value does exist under capitalism. Yeah, I mean, you alluded to it and then shied away from it. And I'm going to under communism, sorry, or under Soviet communism. And I similarly would like to shy away from like definitively saying the law of value does or doesn't exist. But that's the argument that he's trying to make, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can take that a step further, though, too, like this idea of the form of capitalist production, like, and project it onto the subsumption of capitalism by communism, right? Because he really, really made a good point where, and it's kind of understated a little bit, where it's like you cannot do a post-capitalist, like you can't do communism with the forms of capitalism. Like you can't do communism with the factory system, with, I suppose you could apply it to a million different things, but like, that raises a question where it's like, on what, first of all, you need to have a plan for how these things are going to be gone away with. And you'd like it to just happen naturally, because you don't want to just have to go into every factory and, force them all to operate in different ways. But it also raises a point where it's like those capitalist forms probably will still continue on for at least a little while. It depends on what you're talking about specifically, varying lengths of time when you have communism. I think that this is probably like the most important part of Marx's low versus high communism stage theory, right? Where it's like, it is communism, you have communist social relations, but you're still dealing with bourgeois right, you're still dealing with like capitalist philosophies about work, even like the psychology behind why people work in the way that they do. And I mean, you can also apply this to like how people live, how people commute. It's just that probably like the most important stuff is like how things are actually produced. But anyway, like it's his point, which is I think a very mature one, is that like you can't have communism and plan it to continue with capitalist, like Taylorist, Fordist firms, right? Like we spoke a little bit about this when we talked about like the Volvo plants, where they tried to do this like more efficient and just like more enjoyable way of working around like production groups, as opposed to like production belt kind of stuff. What's it called? Like when you're working on a factory line or whatever.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. But it's like the point behind that though is that capitalism tried to do that because it saw that it was more efficient, and then couldn't because of its class component. So it's like it's an interesting like mirror of the point that Arthur is making here, where he's like, communism can't have capitalist forms, but also capitalism, even though it needs to, can't have communist forms in like a really interesting way. Like I know we've heard like Donal and them talk about the Toyota production system and about how they've tried to do certain things that would make it more efficient, but because of the class structure of capitalism, you just can't. And it's an interesting way of like, kind of mirroring his argument. You do need to kind of like change the forms of production, or at least have a plan for these things to just, weasel out naturally, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Withering
away of the Taylorist production line. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. But it's funny, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we're still left with the sort of like Jasper Burns argument, right? So like, okay, so the Soviet Union didn't have the law of value, it didn't have a spring. We need to work out what the mechanism of socialism is going to be that's sort of going to like improve productivity, drive efficiency, like direct work towards the right kind of ends so that it produces the right kind of social goods, blah blah blah.
But like, is that not just like self-management? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I don't know. I totally understand his argument, and like I get what he's saying, but it's like that's the thing that kind of never stuck super well with me with communization, because it's like, I don't know, like his argument where he was like, there's no way to discipline producers in the group of international communist thing, so you'd have to resort to like violent state-like apparatuses. And it's like, not really. Like, I see what he's saying, like there could be a society like that, but if you don't have rules, then it's definitely going to be that. Then it's just going to be like little groups of communes going around like imposing their will on people. Like, I feel like once you have actual workers' control and self-management and communal reproduction of firms, it's like, what is then the impetus is on you to explain like why people wouldn't want to improve production in a way that isn't just fully driven by the value firm. Like, I don't know. It's like, yeah.
I mean, it just comes down to the question that you started with: how black-pilled are we?
How black-pilled are we?
How much do we trust the workers?
Yeah, I mean, that
or let's forget what. Like, how much do we trust human beings to like choose to like work harder, work more, work well with one another?
Yeah, but it's not even that though.
Like,
it's
take on criticism from other firms, find ways to improve their working capacity, even if they aren't necessarily compelled to by some negative or violent.
Well, that's it. That's it. I think you hit the nail on the head there, because it's like, what I'm saying is, yeah, people would always be interested in improving their material well-being of their community and their ecology. That will happen. The question is, though, then it's like, okay, but what are you going to do about where all of your cobalt comes from? What are you going to do about where all of the mines are? What are you going to do about the phosphorus mines? What are you going to do about all of the like shit like that? Then it's a bit more of an open question. But then it just gets back to the question that you're saying, where it's like last episode, it's like, how communist is your populace? You know what I mean? Like, hopefully we can just get to a point where people recognize, hey, me taking a shift in the mines, happy to do it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Don't know.
Yeah, I guess what I took from the fundamental principles was like sort of like a decision that it was morally okay to tie people's ability to consume to their ability to work, like removing like certain obvious impediments to the ability to work, like being too young or being too old or having certain disabilities, whatever. Like a relationship existing there as a sort of transitionary form of relation between capitalism and communism seemed appropriate. I don't know whether for Jasper Burns that's just like too violent, too much. I don't know. Don't know how you feel.
I mean, yeah, I don't feel that, but I definitely see what he's saying, mm-hmm. And I don't just want to be like,
that's not like
work is needed, but it's also like the thing is it's like trying to take a side on that. This new communizer GIC spat is like, to a certain extent, it's kind of silly, because it's like, the one thing that really frustrated me about that Jasper Burns book is when he's like, we can skip straight to high stage communism because Paul Maddox said so. And it's like, go read the introduction to the GIC thing where Paul Maddox is like, we can skip straight there because I said so. And it's like, well, no, you can't. It's like, to what level are we productive, like in a qualitatively good way enough to just get there? Regardless, though, I think my point is like, so much of this information is impossible to know beforehand that it like, you can't really just pick a side, because it's like, you're probably going to get to a point where it's like, either we're way more productive than we think, and we need way less labor time than we think, even with, trying to produce food ecologically. In which case it's like, yeah, man, like whatever, just take what you want, work what you want. Like, as long as we get these few labor hours, it's all good, brother. But like, or that could not be the case. I don't know. And it's like, I don't know. Whenever anyone tries to be like, it is the case or it isn't the case, I definitely err more on the side of like, probably isn't the case for a number of reasons. But like, I don't actually know that. It's like, I don't know. That Paul Maddox introduction is so funny, because it's just like, I don't know if that's what you want to be citing. He's just like, we can skip straight to everybody taking as needed. It's like, there's so much of the production chain that's so rotten, dude. Like, I don't know about that, man. Like, I don't know. Where did he retire to? Like Pennsylvania or something like that? Maybe in rural Pennsylvania you could do that. I don't know.
Living on Murray Bookchin's commune, I bet.
That's the dream. Bookchinian communism. All right. Well, do we have anything to say on the Mazzaro stuff? Um,
Um,
I think Arthur's main point, which is like when he starts talking about capital existing versus capitalism existing, and about how there was capital before capitalism, but isn't until capital started running the whole show that you could really fully call it capitalism. I think that's all really good, and I think his point that like he seems to think that like in the Soviet Union, capital was negated, but it was not superseded. I think it's fine. I think it's like a fine point, and it speaks to his kind of like clock without a spring argument, right? Where it's like they tried to do something else. To him, value was gone. All of these things of capitalism were gone, but it just was not a coherent mode of production because it wasn't stable and there weren't, any kind of like set rules for it to be self-reproducing. You know what I mean?
I mean, you've used the two words there that I've been trying to remember, negation and supercision, so I'm glad that you say that right at the end.
There you go. We help each other. You say production line, I say superseded.
Conveyor belt.
Conveyor belt.
Production
there you go.
I did not help you, Jack. Yes. First, you must negate capitalism, and then you have to supersede it.
Yeah,
no, you have to do both at the same time.
Just the last thing. What did you like make of his talk on what a mode of production is? Because like, does this make you err more towards the side of being a little bit kind of fast and loose with the idea of a mode of production, where it like needs to? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's the reverse, right? Where it's like this is actually a bit more structured, where it's like you need to have a set group of things in order to have a mode of production. I think who was it he quoted? It was like Ernst Mandel or somebody like that, when he made the point where he was like, modes of production and social relations are two completely different things. And like, social relations will exist when there's like more than one person. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, like, it makes me wonder, like somebody else has said this before that I've heard say that, like, there is a question of, like, has there been a mode of production before capitalism? In the sense that, like, he makes the point that, like, well, he says some interesting things. He says some interesting things about, like, I've always just taken, okay, under capitalism, the mechanism is like you discipline labor and you make it more productive. And I've almost taken the sort of very black and white reading that like didn't happen at any other point in history. And he sort of makes, I can't remember exactly what point he makes, but he like, or how he phrased it, but he sort of like, that did happen, like, but capitalism makes it like a fundamental part of its content, such that it builds a whole mechanism around the necessity to discipline labor. So I don't know whether that's a point. That's one thing, but then also, like, I don't know, like, whether any other mode of production has had a driving force behind it in the way that capitalism can very concretely be said to have had one, kind of thing. So I don't know. They're my thoughts. Yeah. I guess in some ways, like, like, modes of production make sense theoretically, and then you sort of lay them over history and like, or lay them over like a concrete analysis of at any point in history, and you can always find anomalies and aberrations and like things trending toward capitalism in the 12th century, and then it doesn't happen or whatever. And like,
they're abstractions.
He says some really interesting things about like why was the Soviet Union not feudalism necessarily, in the sense that like drawing allusions between the factory manager or the bureaucrat and like the workers that work under them necessarily being tied to the factory in the same way that the serfs were tied to the feudal estate, I suppose. I don't know. It's all fun.
Yeah. Is it? Yeah. For when I was reading that bit of this, I had this like vision where I was like, is this just what people mean by neo-feudalism? Like, is this what people think is happening? Like, we're just moving towards the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Because Elon Musk is going to put the chip in our brains that make us like incapable of going to work in any other workplace.
Stay away from seagulls. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. Modes of production. Yeah. Interesting. But the one thing I'll say on that is, though, that it feels a little bit like normalizing to be like a mode of production needs to have a driving force behind it that does something to labor, because it's like, well, that's just what capitalism does. But then also you could also take it as saying like, European feudalism kind of had something like a driving force to expand. It was just way slower and kind of just at the expense of like the material of the community, meaning like the ecology and like, you know, it was just like an absolute growth, which obviously eventually ran out. It's one of the reasons there are no forests here. Thanks very much. What are you going to do?
Yeah. I mean, that's the Perry Anderson distinction, isn't it? Between
exactly.
Like improving labor versus improving the productivity of land as being the sort of driving force of feudalism.
Yeah. Well, but also, like, if you wanted to talk about like a relatively harmonious and stable mode of production, it's just primitive communism, right? Like, it's just hunter-gatherer society. That was it forever. It's like capitalism's barely been around compared to that.
Yeah. You make a very good point.
Well, that gets us back to what our Kronstadt is in our answer, which is the plow. Dear. Yeah. Right. Cool. Well, now we have an answer for when people ask us about the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Tractor's bad.
Tractor's bad. Yeah, exactly. That is so funny, though, the idea that like
good. I know.
The like all of the like ink that's wasted about like how stupid Stalin was to be like value is good in communism, and here he's just like he wishes he had
if only
value, man. If only like that's really funny. All right, enjoyable once again, Dan.
Yes. Next week something else.
It'll be great. Cool. Thanks, man.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Great.
Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us if we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.